The water bottle was still cold when they found it. Condensation beading on the plastic surface, dripping onto the dirt trail where it had been left behind. August heat pressing down on Georgetown, Kentucky like a weight, the kind of afternoon that turns breathing into work. Marcus Thompson's water bottle sat abandoned on the jogging path, next to his Bengals practice jersey, the one with his number stretched across the back, still damp with sweat. But Marcus Thompson was gone. August 6th, 2003. That's when Georgetown College, home to the Cincinnati Bengals training camp, learned that security and structure mean nothing when someone decides to take everything from you. They found his running shoes first, laces still tied the way he double-knotted them before heading out. His earbuds lay tangled in the grass beside the trail, still connected to a CD player that had run out of battery hours ago. Everything looked normal, like he'd just stepped away for a moment, except for the one thing that mattered most. Marcus. Now, here's what I need you to think about. How close have you come to achieving your biggest dream? That moment when everything you've worked for is finally within reach. When years of sacrifice are about to pay off. When you can almost touch the life you've imagined since you were a kid. Because what happened to Marcus Thompson will make you realize just how fragile those dreams really are, and how the people you least suspect can destroy them in an instant. Marcus Thompson was 23 years old, an undrafted free agent defensive back who'd spent his entire life being told he wasn't good enough. Too small for the big schools, not fast enough for the scouts, overlooked in the draft. But he'd earned an invitation to Bengals training camp anyway, impressing new head coach Marvin Lewis during a workout that should have been just another rejection. This was his shot. His one chance to prove everyone wrong, to make an NFL roster against impossible odds, to live the underdog story that people make movies about. He'd been at training camp for 2 weeks. Coaches were noticing him. His position coach, Leslie Frazier, told reporters Marcus had been one of the hardest workers on the field, first to arrive at practice, last to leave. Teammates described him as focused, determined, positive. He was living his dream right up until the moment he went for an evening run on August 6th and never came back. Before we go any further, I want to know where you're watching from right now. Drop your location and the current time in the comments below. I love seeing where our Cold Case Scenes family is tuning in from around the world. Are you watching this at 2 a.m. in Toronto, during your lunch break in Dallas? Let me know down below, and if you're drawn to cases where justice takes decades to arrive, but arrives nonetheless, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story will take us places nobody in Georgetown ever expected to go. Go ahead and hit that like button too, because what happened next would haunt this community for over 20 years. What they discovered 3 months later would confirm everyone's worst fears. And the person responsible? They'd been hiding in plain sight the entire time, watching the search, watching the grief, carrying a secret that would stay buried for more than 2 decades. This is the story of how a promising young athlete vanished from one of the most secure environments in professional sports, and how the truth finally came to light in 2025. Marcus Thompson grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the youngest of 3 boys in a family that lived and breathed football every Sunday. His mother, Patricia, worked double shifts as a nurse at Miami Valley Hospital. His father, Robert, drove trucks for a living, gone for days at a time, but never missing Marcus's high school games. They weren't wealthy. College wasn't guaranteed. But Patricia Thompson made her sons a promise. Work hard enough, and doors would open. Marcus took that promise seriously. He played defensive back at Central State University, a Division II school in Wilberforce, Ohio, where NFL scouts rarely bothered to show up. While kids at Ohio State and Michigan were getting national television coverage and first-round projections, Marcus was playing in front of a few hundred fans on Saturday afternoons, knowing nobody was watching. But he played like they were. Every snap, every practice, every film session. He studied receivers' tendencies until he could predict routes before they happened. He ran extra conditioning drills when his teammates headed back to the dorms. He asked coaches to stay late and break down tape with him, learning to read offenses the way his mother read patient charts, looking for the details everyone else missed. His college coaches described him as obsessive in the best way possible. The kind of player who texted questions about defensive schemes at midnight. The kind who showed up to optional workouts like they were mandatory. Marcus stood 5'10" and weighed 185 pounds, small by NFL standards, but he played bigger than his frame suggested. He hit like someone twice his size, compensating for what he lacked in physical gifts with perfect timing and relentless effort. The 2003 NFL Draft came and went without Marcus hearing his name called. All 7 rounds, 262 players selected. Marcus Thompson wasn't one of them. His mother cried. His father sat quietly, jaw clenched, angry at a system that overlooked his son. But Marcus refused to quit. He'd spent his entire life being counted out, being told he wasn't big enough, fast enough, talented enough. One more rejection wasn't going to stop him. He trained harder, ran faster, studied more tape. Then his agent got the call. The Cincinnati Bengals wanted him at training camp. Not a contract, just an invitation. A chance to compete for a roster spot as an undrafted free agent. The odds were brutal. Most undrafted players never make it past training camp. But it was a chance. And Marcus Thompson had built his entire life on making the most of chances nobody else thought he deserved. The 2003 Bengals training camp took place at Georgetown College, a small liberal arts school about an hour north of Lexington. The campus felt more like a postcard than a professional football facility. Brick buildings covered in ivy, tree-lined pathways connecting dormitories to practice fields. Students riding bikes between classes while NFL players ran drills on fields that doubled as the college team's home turf. It was quiet, contained, safe. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where nothing bad was supposed to happen. This was Marvin Lewis's first year as head coach, and he'd brought a new energy to a franchise that desperately needed it. The Bengals hadn't had a winning season since 1990. They were rebuilding, looking for players who wanted to prove something. Marcus fit that description perfectly. Leslie Frazier, the Bengals' defensive backs coach, noticed Marcus immediately. Years later, Frazier would tell reporters that Marcus stood out not because of his physical talent, but because of his preparation. While other rookies were overwhelmed by the complexity of NFL defenses, Marcus was asking questions that showed he'd already studied the playbook cover to cover. He knew assignments before coaches finished explaining them. He anticipated adjustments. He encouraged other defensive backs during water breaks, building relationships with players who were technically his competition. Teammates remembered Marcus as the guy who stayed late watching film in the dormitory common room, rewinding plays over and over, taking notes in a spiral notebook he carried everywhere. He texted his mother every night after practice. Patricia saved those messages. They revealed a young man who couldn't believe his luck, who felt grateful for every single day he got to wear a Bengals helmet. "Mom, Coach Frazier said I had a great practice today. I'm getting better. I can feel it. Ran the 40 again, shaved 0.03 seconds off my time. Every little bit helps. I know I can make this team. I just need to keep working. Training camp operated on strict schedules. Morning meetings at 7 a.m., breakfast at 8 a.m., practice from 9:30 to noon, lunch, film study, afternoon practice, dinner, more film study, curfew at 10 p.m. Every player accounted for, every movement tracked. It was structured, controlled, monitored. The kind of environment where someone disappearing should have been impossible. But on August 6, 2003, Marcus Thompson went for his usual evening run after dinner, just like he'd done every day since arriving at training camp. Teammates saw him leave the dormitory around 6:45 p.m., earbuds in, wearing his practice jersey and running shorts. He told his roommate he'd be back in an hour. That was the last time anyone saw Marcus Thompson alive. Evening runs were part of Marcus's routine, not required by the team, just something he did on his own. After dinner in the Georgetown College cafeteria, while other players headed back to their dorm rooms to relax or play video games, Marcus laced up his running shoes and hit the trails that wound through campus and into the wooded areas beyond. It helped him clear his head, process the day's practices, visualize the plays he needed to perfect. His roommate, a linebacker from Florida State, was used to seeing Marcus disappear for an hour after meals. August 6, 2003 started like every other day at training camp. Morning meetings, 2 practices in oppressive Kentucky heat, film study. By 6:30 p.m., players were exhausted, hungry, counting down to dinner. Marcus sat with a group of defensive backs in the cafeteria, eating grilled chicken and rice, talking about the afternoon practice where he'd broken up 3 passes in coverage drills. Position coach Leslie Frazier had pulled him aside afterward to tell him he was having a strong camp. Marcus couldn't stop smiling. At 6:45 p.m., he left the dormitory. His roommate watched him plug in his earbuds, adjust his CD player, head toward the main trail that connected the athletic facilities to the older part of campus. Standard routine, nothing unusual. Marcus said he'd be back by 8 p.m. for the evening team meeting. 8 p.m. came and went. Marcus's seat in the meeting room stayed empty. At first, nobody panicked. Maybe he'd lost track of time. Maybe he'd stopped to ice his legs in the training room. But when Leslie Frazier checked the training room and found it empty, concern started building. Marcus Thompson didn't miss meetings. He didn't show up late. He didn't lose track of time when it came to football. By 8:30 p.m., team officials were searching the dormitories. His roommate confirmed Marcus had gone running and hadn't returned. His cell phone sat on his desk, charging. His wallet, his keys, everything was still in his room except Marcus. The initial reaction from some staff members bordered on annoyance rather than worry. Young players sometimes cracked under pressure. Training camp was intense, competitive, mentally exhausting. Maybe Marcus had decided it was too much. Maybe he'd walked off campus to clear his head. Maybe he'd even quit and was too embarrassed to say goodbye. Leslie Frazier shut that theory down immediately. Marcus Thompson doesn't quit, he told campus security. Something's wrong. Teammates echoed that sentiment. The defensive backs Marcus had eaten dinner with insisted he'd been in good spirits, excited about his progress, talking about the upcoming preseason game like he'd definitely be part of it. Nothing in his demeanor suggested he was struggling or considering leaving. By 9 p.m., Georgetown College campus security began a formal search. By 9:30 p.m., they'd called the Georgetown Police Department. By 10 p.m., flashlights were sweeping across the trails Marcus was known to run. The Howe running path started behind the athletic complex, a paved trail that gradually transitioned to packed dirt as it wound deeper into the wooded areas surrounding campus. During daylight, it was popular with students and faculty. After sunset, it became isolated, dark, the kind of place most people avoided. Streetlights only covered the first quarter mile. Beyond that, tree cover blocked most ambient light from campus buildings. You needed a flashlight to navigate safely after dark. They found his belongings at 10:47 p.m. Officer James Whitfield from the Georgetown Police Department spotted the water bottle first, sitting upright on the edge of the trail about half a mile from campus. The bottle sat perfectly positioned, like someone had placed it there deliberately. Not dropped, not knocked over, just sitting there, still cold, condensation still visible on the plastic surface. 15 feet away, Marcus's practice jersey lay folded on a fallen log. Folded, not torn off in a struggle, not discarded carelessly. Folded with the Bengals logo visible, the number facing up. His earbuds were wrapped neatly around his CD player, placed on top of the jersey like someone had taken time to organize them. Officer Whitfield radioed for backup, requested additional units, called for more lights. Something about the scene felt wrong. If Marcus had been injured, collapsed from heat exhaustion, had a medical emergency, his belongings would be scattered. If he'd been attacked, there would be signs of struggle. But everything was arranged too neatly, too carefully, like someone had staged it. They searched through the night, flashlight beams cutting through darkness, voices calling Marcus's name, hoping for a response that never came. Georgetown College students joined the search as word spread. By midnight, more than 50 people were combing through woods, checking buildings, searching anywhere Marcus might have gone. The timeline didn't make sense. Marcus's roommate saw him leave at 6:45 p.m. A Georgetown College student named Brandon Mills reported passing a jogger matching Marcus's description around 7 p.m., heading deeper into the trail system, earbuds in, running at a steady pace. Brandon said the jogger didn't seem distressed or injured, just running normally. But another witness complicated things. An elderly Georgetown resident named Margaret Hayes told police she'd seen a young black man matching Marcus's description walking on a road about a mile from campus around 7:30 p.m., not running anymore, walking quickly like he was headed somewhere specific. When Officer Whitfield pressed for details, Margaret admitted the lighting had been poor. She'd only seen him for a few seconds from her car. She couldn't be completely certain it was Marcus. By dawn on August 7th, Marcus Thompson had been missing for 12 hours. His mother, Patricia, received the call at 6 a.m. from Bengals head coach Marvin Lewis, personally. She collapsed. Robert Thompson took the phone from his wife shaking hands and asked the question every parent dreads asking. Is my son alive? Coach Lewis couldn't answer. Nobody could. Marcus Thompson had vanished from a secure, monitored training camp environment, leaving behind belongings that suggested something terrible had happened. But there was no body, no witnesses, no clear evidence of what exactly occurred on that trail after the sun went down. The search continued, but hope was already fading. October 18th, 2003. 3 months after Marcus Thompson vanished. The search had long since scaled back. Volunteers had returned to their normal lives, and the Bengals had finished their season without him. Georgetown College students walked past the memorial someone had built near the trail where his belongings were found, fresh flowers replaced weekly by people who refused to forget. But leads had dried up. Witnesses had no new information. The case was turning cold. Then a deer hunter named Thomas Crawford made the discovery that would confirm everyone's worst fears. Crawford was tracking a wounded buck through dense woods about 15 miles northeast of Georgetown College, near a place locals called Rawlings Hollow. It wasn't really a hollow, just a designation someone had given the area decades ago that stuck. The terrain was brutal, steep slopes covered in thick brush, fallen trees creating natural barriers, limestone outcroppings that made hiking treacherous. This wasn't somewhere you stumbled into by accident. You had to want to be there, had to have a reason to navigate terrain that fought you every step. Crawford followed a blood trail down a ravine, pushing through underbrush that scratched his arms and caught on his jacket. The wounded buck had gone deeper into an area Crawford rarely hunted, too difficult to navigate, too far from any roads to drag a kill back out. But he'd shot the animal, felt obligated to finish what he'd started rather than let it suffer. That's when he saw the shoe. A running shoe, partially buried under leaves and debris, the white sole still visible against the brown and orange of autumn decay. Crawford stopped, stared at it, felt his stomach tighten. Deer don't wear shoes. He moved closer, pulled out his flashlight even though it was mid-afternoon. The tree cover made the hollow dark, shadows pooling between trunks and rocks. The shoe was attached to something. Someone. Crawford called 911 at 2:37 p.m. His voice shook when he told the dispatcher what he'd found. By 3 p.m., Georgetown Police, Kentucky State Police, and Scott County Sheriff's deputies were scrambling to reach the location. The terrain was so difficult that first responders had to park on a rural highway and hike nearly a mile through woods to reach Crawford, who'd stayed at the scene, sitting on a rock outcropping 50 yards away, unable to look at what he'd found, but unwilling to leave. Detective Ray Kovacs from the Kentucky State Police arrived at 4:15 p.m. and immediately understood why this location had never been searched during the initial investigation. You couldn't see the hollow from any trail or road. The ravine was hidden behind natural limestone formations that created a kind of bowl, invisible unless you descended into it directly. Even then, the body had been concealed beneath brush and fallen branches, deliberately covered, deliberately hidden by someone who knew this area well enough to understand it wouldn't be found easily. The DOB medical examiner, Dr. Sharon Winters, confirmed identity through dental records 2 days later. Marcus Thompson. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head. Multiple impact points suggesting repeated strikes with a heavy object, possibly a rock or metal implement. Dr. Winters kept other details confidential, information only the killer would know, the kind of evidence prosecutors would need if someone was ever arrested. But even without those details, the truth was clear. Marcus Thompson had been murdered. The case shifted overnight. Missing person posters came down, replaced by homicide investigation protocols. The Georgetown Police Department's 3-person detective unit was overwhelmed immediately. Kentucky State Police took over as lead agency, bringing resources and personnel that a small town force couldn't provide. FBI agents arrived from the Louisville field office, offering assistance under federal jurisdiction because Marcus had been involved with the NFL at the time of his death. Georgetown College issued a statement expressing devastation and offering full cooperation with investigators. Students who'd participated in the initial search 3 months earlier now walked around campus looking over their shoulders, realizing someone had killed an NFL player practically on their doorstep. If Marcus Thompson, young, strong, athletic, could be murdered, anyone could be. The Cincinnati Bengals released a statement from head coach Marvin Lewis. Marcus Thompson was taken from us in an act of senseless violence. He was a young man with unlimited potential, dedicated to his craft, loved by his teammates. Our hearts break for his family. We will honor his memory and support law enforcement in any way possible. Leslie Frazier flew to Dayton for the funeral. He stood in the back of Mount Calvary Baptist Church, tears running down his face, while Patricia Thompson sobbed in the front pew, her husband Robert holding her upright, their family shattered beyond repair. Teammates who'd eaten dinner with Marcus just hours before he disappeared struggled to understand how someone could do this. Why Marcus? What had he done to deserve this? Evidence recovered at the scene suggested this wasn't random. Investigators found tire impressions on an old logging road about a quarter-mile from where Marcus's body was discovered. The road hadn't been used in years, overgrown with vegetation, barely visible unless you knew it existed. Someone had driven there recently, within the past 3 months. Someone had parked, carried, or dragged Marcus's body down the ravine, hidden it carefully, then driven away. This case is about to take a turn nobody expected. If you're as invested in finding justice for Marcus as I am, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. And drop a like if you think cold cases deserve to be solved no matter how long it takes. Detective Kovac stood at the scene for hours after the body was removed, studying the terrain, trying to understand how the killer had known about this location. It wasn't visible from any main road. Most Georgetown residents didn't even know Rawlings Hollow existed. Whoever killed Marcus Thompson had intimate knowledge of Scott County's back roads and hidden places. They'd planned this carefully, chosen this spot deliberately. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a random attack by a stranger. Someone had targeted Marcus Thompson specifically, had waited for him on that trail, had killed him, and disposed of his body in a location they knew wouldn't be easily found. The question was why. And the even more terrifying question was who. Because whoever did this was still out there, living their life, hiding their secret, possibly watching the investigation unfold while knowing exactly what happened on August 6th, 2003. Detective Ray Kovac started with the obvious suspects. In homicide investigations, you work from the inside out. Family first, then close associates, then expanding circles of acquaintances and strangers. Marcus Thompson's case followed that pattern, but every avenue led to dead ends. Teammates were the first to be interviewed. Every defensive back at training camp, every player who'd interacted with Marcus, every person who'd been on campus August 6th. The Cincinnati Bengals organization provided complete rosters, schedules, practice footage. Investigators spent weeks reconstructing who was where, at what time. The results were frustrating but definitive. Every single player was accounted for during the window when Marcus disappeared. Group dinners, team meetings, dormitory check-ins. NFL training camps are controlled environments. Players don't vanish for hours without someone noticing. Georgetown College staff came next. Coaches, security guards, maintenance workers, cafeteria employees, administrative personnel, anyone with access to campus, anyone who might have interacted with Marcus. Background checks were run on everyone, past criminal records examined, financial histories reviewed looking for red flags. Nothing suspicious emerged. These were ordinary people working ordinary jobs, none with obvious motives to harm a young athlete they barely knew. Local residents became persons of interest simply by proximity. Detective Kovacs and his team interviewed hundreds of Georgetown residents. Did you see anything unusual August 6th? Did you notice any unfamiliar vehicles? Any strangers in the area? The answers were universally unhelpful. Georgetown was a small town where people noticed outsiders, but nobody had seen anything worth reporting. The physical evidence told them frustratingly little. In 2003, DNA technology existed, but wasn't as sophisticated as it would later become. Investigators collected samples from the scene where Marcus's body was discovered: soil, vegetation, trace fibers from his clothing. They processed everything the medical examiner's office could provide. But degradation from 3 months of exposure to elements had compromised much of what might have been useful. Rain had washed away potential evidence. Wildlife had disturbed the scene. Time had erased details that might have pointed toward a suspect. The tire impressions on the old logging road provided some information. Investigators determined the tread pattern came from a common tire brand, the kind sold at Walmart and AutoZone throughout Kentucky. Thousands of vehicles in the region use those exact tires. Without a specific vehicle to compare them to, the impressions were nearly useless. Witness testimony created more questions than answers. Brandon Mills, the Georgetown College student who'd seen Marcus running around 7 p.m., couldn't provide additional details beyond what he'd already told police. Margaret Hayes, the elderly resident who thought she'd seen someone matching Marcus's description walking near campus, became less certain under follow-up questioning. Maybe it had been Marcus. Maybe it had been someone else. The lighting had been poor. She couldn't swear to it. Investigators explored every theory they could construct. Had Marcus encountered someone on the trail who attacked him for reasons unknown? Possible, but the evidence suggested premeditation, not a random encounter. Had someone from Marcus's past followed him to Georgetown? Background checks on his life in Dayton revealed nothing suspicious. No enemies, no conflicts, no one with reason to harm him. Had this been a case of mistaken identity? Someone targeted for looking like someone else? The theory felt weak, unsupported by evidence. Georgetown changed after Marcus's murder. Parents who'd felt comfortable letting their college-age children attend school, they started questioning that decision. Enrollment dipped the following year. Students who'd routinely jogged the trails after dark stopped doing so. The running path where Marcus's belongings were found became a place people avoided, too haunted by what happened there. Media attention burned hot initially. National news outlets covered the story for weeks. NFL hopeful murdered at training camp made headlines across sports networks and crime shows. But as months passed with no arrests, no breakthroughs, no dramatic developments, the coverage faded. By spring 2004, Marcus Thompson's murder was mentioned only in local papers on anniversaries. By 2005, even those mentions became rare. Patricia Thompson never recovered. She kept Marcus's bedroom exactly as he'd left it before departing for training camp. His trophies from high school and college remained on shelves. His clothes hung in the closet. His playbooks and notebooks, filled with defensive schemes, sat stacked on his desk. She cleaned the room weekly, dusted the surfaces, changed the sheets on his bed as if he might come home and need them. Every August 6th, Patricia held a vigil at Mount Calvary Baptist Church. The first year, hundreds attended. The second year, maybe 50. By the 10th year, just family and a handful of community members who refused to forget. Patricia stood at the front of the church, holding a framed photograph of Marcus in his Bengals practice jersey, asking the same question she'd been asking for years. Who took my son from me? Robert Thompson handled his grief differently, quieter, more internal. He stopped watching football, couldn't bear to see games Marcus should have been playing in. He retired early from trucking, spent his days in the garage working on projects that didn't need working on, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from dwelling on what happened. Detective Kovacs carried the case with him, even after other investigations demanded his attention. Late nights in his home office, he'd pull out the file boxes, review statements he'd read hundreds of times, study crime scene, photographs, hoping something new would reveal itself. His wife found him asleep at his desk more than once, Marcus Thompson's case file open in front of him, notes scrawled in margins where Kovacs had been chasing theories that led nowhere. New detectives periodically reviewed the case with fresh eyes. In 2007, a young investigator named Lisa Martinez spent 3 months re-interviewing witnesses, looking for inconsistencies in original statements. She found none. In 2012, Detective James Thornton requested advanced DNA analysis on evidence stored from the scene. The lab results added nothing useful. In 2018, a cold case unit re-examined every piece of physical evidence with updated technology. Still nothing definitive emerged. The years bled together. 2005 became 2010. 2010 became 2015. Marcus Thompson's murder remained unsolved, filed among hundreds of other cold cases in Kentucky. A young man's potential forever unrealized, a family's questions forever unanswered, a community's sense of safety forever damaged. The truth was out there, locked inside someone's memory, hidden behind someone's lies. But for 20 years, that truth stayed buried just as deeply as Marcus Thompson had been buried in Rawlings Hollow. Until 2025, when everything finally changed. January 2025, 22 years after Marcus Thompson's murder. Detective Ray Kovacs was 61 years old now, 3 years from mandatory retirement, still carrying cases that weighed on him like stones. But Marcus's case weighed heaviest. The file boxes sat in his office, a constant reminder of the promise he'd never been able to keep. Then the Kentucky State Police Cold Case Unit sent out a request that would change everything. Federal funding had become available for a specialized program, re-examining unsolved homicides using forensic technology that hadn't existed when the crimes occurred. The program focused specifically on cases from the late 1990s and early 2000s, the technological gap years when DNA analysis was possible but limited, when evidence was collected but couldn't be fully processed with available methods. Kovacs submitted Marcus Thompson's case file within hours of receiving the request. The evidence boxes arrived at the Kentucky State Police Forensic Laboratory in Frankfort on February 3, 2025. Dr. Michael Reeves, a forensic geneticist specializing in degraded DNA recovery, took personal charge of the Thompson case. He'd built his reputation on extracting usable genetic material from samples other analysts had deemed hopeless. Decades-old evidence didn't intimidate him. It challenged him. The first item Dr. Reeves examined was Marcus's practice jersey, the one found folded on the trail. In 2003, investigators had tested it for DNA and found Marcus's genetic material, as expected, along with traces from several other individuals. But 2003 technology couldn't isolate those traces clearly enough to build prosecutable profiles. The samples were too degraded, too mixed, too complex for the PCR amplification methods available at the time. 2025 technology operated on an entirely different level. Dr. Reeves used advanced STR analysis combined with next-generation sequencing, methods that could separate mixed DNA samples with precision impossible 20 years earlier. He could identify individual contributors from microscopic amounts of genetic material, could build profiles from cells that earlier technology would have missed completely. The process took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of extraction, amplification, sequencing, and analysis. 3 weeks of waiting that had Detective Kovach checking his email obsessively, unable to focus on other cases, unable to think about anything except the possibility that maybe, finally, after 22 years, they'd catch a break. On February 28th, Dr. Reeves called Kovach directly. "We have DNA," he said, his voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of excitement. "A secondary contributor on the jersey. Male. Not Marcus Thompson. Not any of the investigators who processed the evidence in 2003. Someone else." The profile was strong, complete enough to be entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. The database contained genetic profiles from millions of convicted offenders and arrestees nationwide. If their suspect had ever been arrested, convicted, or had their DNA collected for any law enforcement purpose, they'd get a match within minutes. The search ran. No match found. Kovach felt the familiar weight of disappointment settling over him, but Dr. Reeves wasn't finished. "CODIS came up empty," Reeves explained, "but we have another option now, forensic genealogy. Have you heard of it?" Kovach had heard of it, knew it had been used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018, had solved dozens of cold cases since then. But he'd never worked a case that utilized the technology. Dr. Reeves explained the process. Forensic genealogy didn't rely on law enforcement databases. Instead, it used public genealogy websites where people uploaded their DNA to find relatives and build family trees. Companies like GED Match and Family Tree DNA, where millions of people had voluntarily submitted their genetic information hoping to discover cousins or trace their ancestry. The suspect's DNA profile could be uploaded to these databases. The system would search for genetic relatives, people who shared enough DNA markers to indicate family connections. Those relatives became anchor points. From there, genealogists could build family trees backward and forward through time, using birth records, marriage certificates, census data, obituaries, and other public documents. The trees would eventually converge on individuals who fit the suspect profile. Right age, right location, right time frame. It was painstaking work. Not a computer algorithm spitting out names, but human researchers spending weeks or months constructing massive family trees with hundreds of branches, following genetic breadcrumbs through generations. A forensic genealogist named Rebecca Walsh took on Marcus Thompson's case. She'd worked cold cases for 7 years, helped identify suspects in 18 unsolved murders. Her process was methodical, obsessive, the kind of detailed investigative work that required patience most people didn't possess. The DNA upload produced 73 genetic matches. None were close relatives, no parents or siblings, but second cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins scattered across Kentucky, Ohio, Tennessee, and beyond. Rebecca started building trees from each match, working backward through their lineages to find common ancestors, then working forward through those ancestors' descendants to identify every person who could have inherited the genetic markers present in the suspect's DNA. The work took 6 weeks, 6 weeks of birth certificates and marriage records and obituaries, 6 weeks of public records requests and genealogy databases and census documents. 6 weeks of Detective Kovacs sleeping poorly, checking his phone at 2 a.m., hoping for updates, unable to shake the feeling that they were close to something massive. On April 15, 2025, Rebecca Walsh called Kovacs with results that made him sit down heavily in his office chair. "I have 3 potential suspects," she said. "All male, all the right age, all with connections to the Georgetown area in 2003. I need you to help me narrow it down." The 3 names represented 3 different branches of an extended family tree that traced back to a common ancestor in the 1880s. Rebecca walked Kovacs through her methodology, showing him how genetic markers pointed toward this particular family line, how the ages and locations aligned with the crime. Kovacs ran background checks on all 3 immediately. 2 lived in different states now, had moved away from Kentucky years ago. The 3rd still lived in Scott County, just outside Georgetown. His name was David Kellerman. Kovacs stared at the name on his screen, cross-referenced it with the original case files from 2003. David Kellerman had been interviewed during the initial investigation. He'd been a volunteer assistant coach for Georgetown College's football team that summer, helping out during Bengals training camp, doing equipment management and field preparation work. He'd been cleared early. No criminal record. No apparent connection to Marcus beyond casual interactions on campus. His alibi for August 6th had checked out. He'd been at home with his wife that evening. But now, 22 years later, David Kellerman's DNA was on Marcus Thompson's practice jersey. Kovacs felt his pulse quicken. He pulled Kellerman's file, reread the original interview notes. David Kellerman, age 38 in 2003, would be 60 now. Married, 2 children, worked as a physical therapist in Georgetown, coached youth football, volunteered at his church, the kind of person nobody would suspect of anything. Rebecca Walsh ran additional verification, double-checking her genealogy work, confirming the family tree connections. No mistakes. The DNA pointed directly to David Kellerman. But DNA alone wasn't enough for an arrest warrant. They needed more. They needed to place him at the scene, establish motive, build a case that would hold up in court. Kovacs started digging deeper. He pulled Kellerman's phone records from 2003, stored in archived databases, obtained his financial records, requested his employment history from Georgetown College, every piece of information that could establish connection, opportunity, motive. What emerged was a picture nobody had seen in 2003 because nobody had been looking closely enough at someone who seemed so normal, so respectable, so completely above suspicion. And that's when investigators understood. The person who killed Marcus Thompson had been hiding in plain sight for 22 years, protected by a clean record and a trusted reputation, never imagining that technology would eventually catch up to him. The warrant was prepared. The case was built. Justice was finally coming. Detective Kovacs spent 3 days reviewing David Kellerman's life before making any move. This wasn't the kind of case where you could afford mistakes. 22 years of waiting meant the arrest had to be perfect, the evidence overwhelming, the case airtight enough that no defense attorney could create reasonable doubt. David Kellerman looked like the last person anyone would suspect of murder. At 60 years old, he'd spent his entire adult life in Georgetown. Graduated from Georgetown College in 1985 with a degree in exercise science. Married his college sweetheart, Jennifer, in 1987. 2 daughters, both grown now with families of their own. He'd built a successful physical therapy practice on Main Street, treating everyone from high school athletes to elderly residents recovering from surgery. Patients described him as caring, attentive, Someone who remembered your kids' names and asked about your family. He coached youth football for 15 years, shaping young players, teaching fundamentals, emphasizing sportsmanship. Parents trusted him with their children. The Georgetown Rotary Club named him Citizen of the Year in 2019 for his community service work. He volunteered at First Baptist Church, helped organize charity runs, donated to local schools. This was not a man anyone would associate with violence, but Detective Kovacs learned a long time ago that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like your neighbor, your coach, your physical therapist. The deeper Kovacs dug, the more cracks appeared in David Kellerman's perfect reputation. In August 2003, Kellerman had been a volunteer assistant with Georgetown College's football program, helping during the 2 weeks the Cincinnati Bengals used the campus for training camp. His role involved equipment setup, field maintenance, assisting with logistics. He had access to the facilities, knew the players' schedules, understood the training camp routine, including the fact that Marcus Thompson ran the trails every evening after dinner. Kellerman's original 2003 alibi stated he'd been home with his wife the evening of August 6th. Jennifer Kellerman confirmed it during her interview. They'd eaten dinner together, watched television, normal evening at home. Investigators in 2003 had no reason to doubt it. David Kellerman wasn't on anyone's radar as a potential suspect. He was a helpful volunteer, a respected community member, someone investigators probably thanked for his cooperation. But Kovacs requested phone records from August 2003, archived data that telecommunications companies were required to maintain. David Kellerman's cell phone pinged off a tower near Georgetown College at 6:58 p.m. on August 6, 2003. Not at his home 3 miles away, on campus, right when Marcus Thompson was running. The phone remained in that location until 8:43 p.m. Then it moved, pinging off towers along rural Highway 460, the road that led toward Rawlings Hollow. Jennifer Kellerman's statement from 2003 was a lie. Either she'd lied to protect her husband, or David had lied to her about where he'd been that evening. Kovacs obtained Kellerman's financial records next, looking for anything unusual in the months surrounding Marcus's murder. What he found made the motive suddenly, horrifyingly clear. In July 2003, David Kellerman had borrowed $75,000 from a private lender in Lexington. The terms were predatory, the kind of desperate financing people sought when legitimate banks wouldn't help them. His physical therapy practice was failing. Medical insurance reimbursement rates had dropped, overhead costs had increased, and Kellerman was drowning in debt he'd hidden from his wife. Marcus Thompson had no money. He was an undrafted free agent with no contract, no signing bonus, no wealth whatsoever. So, what was the connection? Kovacs found it in betting records. In 2003, illegal sports gambling ran through underground networks. Bookies taking action on everything from NFL games to college football to obscure sporting events. Kovacs contacted a retired FBI agent who'd worked organized crime in Kentucky during that era, asked about gambling operations around Georgetown in 2003. The agent remembered David Kellerman's name. Kellerman had been a degenerate gambler, betting amounts he couldn't afford on games he couldn't predict. He'd run up debts with a Louisville-based bookmaking operation, owed money he had no way of paying. The FBI had interviewed him during a larger gambling investigation, but never charged him with anything. He was a customer, not an operator. By August 2003, Kellerman owed approximately $90,000 to various bookies and lenders. His physical therapy practice was on the verge of bankruptcy. His house was mortgaged beyond its value. He was facing financial ruin, and had hidden it all from his wife, his family, his community. Here's where the motive crystallized in a way that made Kovach's stomach turn. Someone had approached David Kellerman in late July 2003 with a proposition. The details would emerge later during prosecution, but the essence was simple. Payment in exchange for ensuring a specific Bengals player didn't make the roster. Not through bribes or game fixing, through elimination. Point-shaving schemes and sports corruption weren't new, but this took it to a level that shocked even veteran investigators. Someone stood to profit significantly if Marcus Thompson didn't make the Cincinnati Bengals roster, and David Kellerman was desperate enough, debt-ridden enough, morally bankrupt enough to accept the job. Marcus Thompson was murdered for gambling money. A young man's NFL dream, his entire future, his family's hope and pride, all destroyed because David Kellerman needed to pay off betting debts, and someone was willing to finance that payoff in exchange for murder. The arrest is about to happen, and what investigators found when they searched the suspect's property will shock you. Make sure you've hit that subscribe button, because this story shows why we never stop fighting for justice, even after 22 years. Kovach brought his findings to the Commonwealth's attorney for Scott County. They reviewed every piece of evidence. The DNA match, the cell phone records placing Kellerman at the scene, the financial motive, the lies told in 2003. They built a timeline that showed opportunity, means, and motive. On April 22, 2025, a Scott County judge issued an arrest warrant for David Kellerman, charging him with murder in the death of Marcus Thompson. Kovach assembled a team for the arrest. Kentucky State Police, FBI agents, Scott County Sheriff's deputies. They weren't taking chances. 22 years of waiting ended now, and nothing could go wrong. Before they moved, Kovach did one more thing. He drove to Dayton, Ohio, sat across from Patricia Thompson in the living room, where Marcus's bedroom remained unchanged, and told her they'd identified her son's killer. Patricia Thompson was 73 years old. 22 years of grief had aged her beyond her years. She sat in her chair, holding the same framed photograph she'd held at every vigil, and asked the question she'd been asking since 2003. Why? Why my son? Money, Kovach said quietly. Gambling debts. Your son was killed for money. Patricia closed her eyes. Tears ran down her face. Not relief, not closure, just exhaustion. 22 years of carrying a weight she could finally set down, even though setting it down didn't bring Marcus back. When? She asked. When do you arrest him? Tomorrow morning, Kovach said. I wanted you to know first. The next morning, justice would finally arrive at David Kellerman's door. April 23, 2025. 6:47 a.m. Detective Ray Kovach stood outside David Kellerman's home, a modest two-story house on Ashwood Drive with a well-maintained lawn and a home sweet home sign hanging near the front door. Backup units positioned themselves at every exit. FBI agents covered the rear of the property. 22 years had led to this moment. Kovach knocked at 6:50 a.m. Jennifer Kellerman answered, still in her bathrobe, confusion crossing her face when she saw the badges and uniforms filling her front yard. Can I help you? We need to speak with David Kellerman, Kovach said. David appeared behind his wife, dressed for work in khakis and a polo shirt embroidered with his physical therapy practice logo. He looked at Kovach, at the officers, at the vehicles blocking his driveway. His face went pale, but his voice stayed steady. What's this about? David Kellerman, you're under arrest for the murder of Marcus Thompson. The words hung in the air. Jennifer gasped, grabbed the doorframe for support. David's face went from pale to gray. "What? No, that's impossible. I didn't kill anyone." Kovac read him his rights while officers moved into the house, securing the scene. David kept repeating the same phrase. "This is a mistake. You've got the wrong person. I don't know what you're talking about." They transported him to the Kentucky State Police Post in Frankfort, placed him in an interview room with nothing but a table, 2 chairs, and a recording camera. Kovac let him sit there for 30 minutes before entering, giving Kellerman time to think about how much trouble he was facing. When Kovac finally walked in, Kellerman's demeanor had shifted from shocked to defensive. "I want a lawyer." "That's your right," Kovac said, "but I want to show you something first." He placed the DNA report on the table, explained how they'd recovered genetic material from Marcus Thompson's practice jersey, how forensic genealogy had traced that DNA directly to David Kellerman, how there was no mistake, no misidentification, no confusion. Kellerman stared at the report. His hands were shaking. Kovac placed the cell phone records next, showed him the tower pings that put his phone at Georgetown College the evening Marcus disappeared. On the highway toward Rawlings Hollow later that night, nowhere near his home where he'd claimed to be. "Your wife lied for you in 2003, Kovac said, "or you lied to her. Either way, you weren't home. You were with Marcus Thompson." Kellerman's lawyer arrived 40 minutes later, a Georgetown attorney named Richard Walsh, who took one look at the evidence and asked for a private consultation with his client. They spoke for an hour. When Walsh emerged, his expression was grim. "My client would like to make a statement." What David Kellerman confessed over the next 2 hours painted a picture of desperation, greed, and calculated violence that made even experienced investigators uncomfortable. In late July 2003, a man Kellerman knew only as Ray from his gambling connections approached him with an offer. Ray worked for people who'd placed substantial bets against Marcus Thompson, making the Cincinnati Bengals roster. If Thompson was gone, those bets paid off significantly. They'd pay Kellerman $100,000, enough to cover his debts and save his failing practice, if he ensured Thompson didn't make it to the preseason games. Kellerman knew the training camp schedule, knew Marcus's evening running routine. He waited on the trail August 6th with a tire iron from his truck. When Marcus jogged past, Kellerman called out to him, pretended to need help with something near the woods. Marcus, trusting and helpful, followed him off the trail. Kellerman struck him from behind, multiple blows. Marcus fought back initially, grabbed at Kellerman's shirt, explaining the DNA transfer. But Kellerman was larger, stronger, had the advantage of surprise. When Marcus stopped moving, Kellerman took his practice jersey and other belongings, staged them on the trail to look like Marcus had disappeared while running. He loaded Marcus's body into his truck bed, covered it with a tarp, and drove to Rawlings Hollow, a place he'd known since childhood from hunting trips with his father. He carried the body down the ravine, covered it with brush, and drove home. Jennifer never knew. His daughters never knew. He'd gone to work the next day like nothing happened, collected his payment in cash installments over the following months, and lived with what he'd done for 22 years. "Did you ever feel remorse?" Kovac asked. Kellerman was quiet for a long time. "Every day. But what could I do? Coming forward wouldn't bring him back." "You could have let his family have answers. You could have let them bury their son with dignity instead of searching for 3 months. Kellerman had no response to that. On April 24, 2025, David Kellerman was formally charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and tampering with physical evidence. Bail was denied. He was transported to Scott County Detention Center to await trial. The news exploded across Georgetown, across Kentucky, across the nation. Social media erupted with disbelief, anger, demands for justice. The man who'd coached youth football, who'd treated patients, who'd been named Citizen of the Year, was a murderer who'd hidden in plain sight for over 2 decades. The Cincinnati Bengals released a statement. Justice has finally arrived for Marcus Thompson. We honor his memory and stand with his family during this difficult time. Leslie Frazier, now retired from coaching, told reporters, Marcus deserved better than what happened to him. He deserved his chance. I hope this brings some peace to his family. Patricia Thompson spoke briefly to local news. 22 years I've waited. 22 years I've prayed for this day. My son can rest now. The trial was set for September 2025. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. David Kellerman's confession, combined with DNA evidence and cell phone records, left little room for defense. Georgetown would finally see justice served. September 15, 2025. The Scott County Courthouse filled beyond capacity for the trial of David Kellerman. News crews lined the street outside. Overflow crowds watched on monitors in adjacent courtrooms. This wasn't just about one murder. This was about a community confronting betrayal by someone they'd trusted for decades. The prosecution presented a case that left no room for doubt. Dr. Michael Reeves testified about the DNA recovered from Marcus Thompson's practice jersey, explaining how advanced technology identified David Kellerman's genetic material with certainty that excluded coincidence or contamination. Phone records placed Kellerman at the scene. Financial records established motive. His own confession provided details only the killer could know, where he'd waited on the trail, how he'd lured Marcus into the woods, what he'd used as a weapon. Kellerman's defense attorney made minimal efforts to challenge the evidence. How could he? The science was sound, the timeline was airtight, and his client had already confessed. The defense's only strategy was arguing for leniency based on Kellerman's otherwise clean record, his community service, his cooperation after arrest. The prosecution called it what it was: irrelevant. Victim impact statements filled an entire afternoon. Patricia Thompson, now 73, stood at the podium with her husband Robert beside her for support. Her voice shook, but never broke. David Kellerman didn't just kill my son. He killed my son's dreams. He killed the joy in our family. He killed 22 years of our lives that we spent searching for answers while he went to work, coached children, pretended to be a good man. Marcus was 23 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him, and this man took that for money. Leslie Frazier traveled from his home in Florida to deliver his statement. I've coached hundreds of players in my career. Marcus Thompson was special, not because of his talent, but because of his heart. He worked harder than anyone, believed in himself when others didn't, and he was taken from us by someone who saw him as nothing more than a financial transaction. That's evil. Former Bengals teammates submitted written statements read aloud by the prosecutor. Georgetown College representatives spoke about the trauma the campus endured, how students still avoided the trails where Marcus disappeared, how his death changed their sense of safety forever. David Kellerman sat expressionless through most of the trial. When given the opportunity to make a final statement before sentencing, he stood, cleared his throat, and spoke for less than a minute. "I'm sorry for what I did. I can't explain why I made that choice. I destroyed Marcus Thompson's life and ruined my own family in the process. I deserve whatever punishment this court gives me." The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of kidnapping, guilty of tampering with physical evidence. Judge Sarah Whitmore delivered the sentence on September 22, 2025. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in quiet tears and exhaled tension. Patricia Thompson collapsed into her husband's arms. Detective Ray Kovach, sitting in the back row, closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of relief after 22 years of carrying this case. David Kellerman was led away in handcuffs. He would spend the rest of his life in a prison cell, finally paying for a crime he'd hidden for more than 2 decades. Georgetown College announced plans for a memorial scholarship in Marcus Thompson's name, awarded annually to an undrafted walk-on player who demonstrates exceptional work ethic and character. The Cincinnati Bengals contributed $100,000 to establish the fund. Marcus Thompson's story would not be forgotten. His dream was stolen, but his legacy would live on. Justice had finally, completely arrived.